and dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
Welcome to Anti-Tyranny News Radio here on UCY.TV. Thank you for joining me this evening. We're going to kind of dive into everything going on right now, not just with the attacks in Paris, but globally, because there is a real big issue here that I think most mainstream media is completely ignoring. I think there's a reason behind it, but you're starting to see everything come to be, and we'll get into that. We'll start off with a little bit on the Paris attacks. Give me a second here. Okay. We'll get into a little bit of that. But I want to get into ISIS and this Ron Paul Liberty Report. Does ISIS exist? Some say no. And people go, well, you know, ISIS was created by the U.S. Well, yes. But the ways it was created, what it is, and what it's become is not something the U.S. is out here controlling. And there is a larger picture that is very alarming. And I really think people should be a lot more alarmed. But we'll get into this Ron Paul Liberty Report first, cover that. And then we'll kind of expand into this broader picture.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, and it's good to see you today, Daniel.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Good. I'd like to talk about ISIS today. There was a report on Zero Hedge, who quoted a journalist by the name of Gerald Coleman. And the theme of this report is there's no such thing as ISIS, which catches your attention all of a sudden. So we want to talk about that. Does ISIS really exist? Is this true or not? It'd be pretty hard, I think, to convince the American people or any of us that ISIS doesn't exist. The significance of it, where it came from and where they get their finances and all these things is a different question. But I think we have been led by our government to believe that, there's radical Islam, and the worst people were in Al-Qaeda, and they came here and killed Americans. But then there was a more radical group, and it was all radical Islam, and they broke away because they weren't, Al-Qaeda wasn't tough enough. And so now we have ISIS, and ISIS is a big deal, especially with the episode in Paris. So, but the question is raised, where did ISIS come from? There are so many questions of how did it pop up and gain so much favor and have financing, putting out magazines, and, where do they get their weapons? And it's pretty easy to put some of these pieces together and find out that they probably were working to some degrees with some of the people in the West, like the United States and maybe some others, and got some advantages here, rather than it being a spontaneous small group of people that all of a sudden took over a large swath of land in Syria and in Iraq. That is probably not true.
Well, what O'Coleman tries to point out is that he says the U.S. Created ISIS, is complicit in the creation of ISIS. And I think you can take that one of two ways. You can take it to sort of the conspiratorial way, which may be true, you need evidence for it, but the U.S. consciously created this group out of thin air to wreak havoc in the Middle East. But you could also look at it another way, which is that U.S. actions in the Middle East created ISIS. We go back to the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq, where you had the Sunni minority completely disenfranchised after the Shia majority took over once democracy hit Iraq, and then the U.S. struggling to prop up the Sunnis and ending up creating Sunni militias, radical Sunni. Al-Qaeda came in, and ISIS broke off from that. So you can say it both ways that the U.S. was complicit.
Yeah, I guess you could look at these two different ways. One is a total conspiracy where they contrive and say, well, let's create ISIS, and ISIS is going to do our bidding. The other is that they get sucked into doing some things, and there are unintended consequences, and they get out of control. But there's been some examples in recent history where our government has been involved in galvanizing so-called enemies that shouldn't be on our side. For instance, in Afghanistan, it's no secret now that we worked very hard with bin Laden and the Mujahideen in order to beat the Soviets, so to speak, and then all of a sudden they became the Taliban, and later on they were killing us.
We got 9/11.
Yeah, that's right. That was the result. But then again, there was another major episode a few years before that, in '88, where it was thought to be the benefit of Israel and the United States to create Hamas. Mm-hmm. And that, I don't think there's any secrets about that. I think that's, in the literature, believing that would be a good way to counteract any political strength of Fatah and the
PLO,
and the PLO. So we've been involved like that. So it's not impossible, but it's also could be stupidity and unintended consequences. But nevertheless, we do have this problem. And I would just like to see if we can get a clear answer on this. I don't think I want to say there is no such thing as ISIS. I think there is, but I don't think ISIS is exactly what the American people think it is, and it seems like the neocons are achieving a great victory, because ISIS in the minds of the American people are the enemy of the world, and therefore once again there will be talk now of the justification to go after Assad and actually put ground troops in there.
Yeah, that's the move now. But to show how disconnected Washington is, either it refuses to admit to the American people the mistakes of its prior foreign policy interventions, or it really is this diluted. But here's John Kerry yesterday, and quoted in the New York Times. Here's his response to all of these things that have happened this week. A ceasefire and a political transition in Syria is crucial to dealing with ISIS. So he said the way to defeat ISIS is to have a ceasefire, but that doesn't include ISIS and Al-Qaeda because they're not going to participate. A ceasefire and then a transition of Assad out of power. Because he said, and here's his take, Assad is complicit in the rise of ISIS. So they're trying to dump it all on Assad's back as if he would create this group that tries to overthrow him.
Yeah, but there was, and we talked about this in a previous program where the DIA, there's some papers were released of them talking about what was going on over there. They wrote that in 2012, and it looked like pretty strong evidence that we were knowledgeable about what might happen and what we were doing and why we might be supporting them.
Well, this is a DIA report that the Judicial Watch got out, heavily redacted, but a couple of really important tidbits. And Zero Hedge rightly, I think, calls it the smoking gun. And I'll read it and sort of paraphrase it. This is the analysis that the DIA that passed the DIA. There is the possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist principality, i.e. Sunni extremist principality in eastern Syria. And this is exactly what the supporting powers to the opposition want, i.e. U.S. and its allies, in order to isolate the Syrian regime, which is considered the strategic depth of the Shia expansion.
See, without this kind of support, how could, a few individuals break away from al-Qaeda and all of a sudden have this land control? They have the money. They put out the magazines. They have weapons. Of course, most people know they're American weapons. Well, we just made a mistake. So it goes on and on. But then the other question is why would we ever be so dumb as to do this? And I think it's sort of political in many ways, is that the American people don't want American boots on the ground, where they don't want soldiers that are getting killed, and they know it's a mess over there. So, well, if we could create something or encourage maybe a natural tendency of some really nutty people to go and do this and do the fighting for them, that they will go and I think their goal probably was to use ISIS to do our battles because we're the ones who declared war against Assad, to go in there and get rid of Assad. And then they think this is a cheap way. We don't have to put boots on the ground. We get them to do the fighting. And the American people will think that they're fighting radical Islam and we'll win the victory. We'll have this victory in a short period of time. But that's where things go wrong because no victory arrives.
The new Polish foreign minister had a very good point yesterday, I think. He noted that what seems to be the majority of the so-called migrants or refugees coming from Syria into Europe seem to be pretty strong, healthy, good-looking men of fighting age. He said, why should we send our troops over there to fight for their country back when these healthy guys are sipping coffee in cafes? Let's help them, send them back to fight for their country.
That's a good statement, and it makes a good political point here, and American people are going to respond to it. But then when you start thinking about that in detail, how many people in Europe right now came from Syria? Yeah. They came from all over. And how many Syrians do we have here? There will be some. But let's say you want to pack them up and all of a sudden carve out a piece of land in Syria. Yeah. Don't we get to invade the country to do this? Do you get the support from NATO? Who's going to pay for it? But what if only 5% are from Syria? I don't know what the percentage is. I don't think anybody knows. But this assumption that we can just carve this out and put all those people. But it's a great point to make is why are they doing over here? And we've commented on this. These individuals, they don't look like they're suffering economically or anything else. They have their cell phones, and I guess some stay in hotels and everything else. But we do see them marching by the thousands and marching through Europe. It's literally an invasion, and I think the propaganda machine is the toughest to counteract, and the propaganda is very, very strong, against ISIS and against radical Islam, and that we have to do something. And I think there's a potential vote in the British Parliament that might come up, and eventually, I guess, Obama will get what he wants.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Now, the British were not able to get a new authorization to use strikes against Syria, but now it's going to be easy. They'll get everything they want and more. But, we put up an article on the Institute's website today written by our friend Peter Van Buren, who always has very important insights. And he makes a pretty obvious point, as good articles usually do, to defeat ISIS, stop the money. And he points out just a few areas. Donations. Most of the money comes from Gulf states, Saudi Arabia. And actually, Putin at the G20 summit just a couple of days ago, he came with evidence saying these are the G20 states that are supporting ISIS, that are giving money to ISIS. So deal with that. Deal with oil. The U.S. is only now starting to hit these oil transports that ISIS is using to raise millions a day, and Turkey, which is in business with ISIS for the oil.
And in the mix there is Iran. They're not going to be too interested in getting rid of ISIS either. Think?
Well, I think they're fighting them in Iraq. The Iranian militias are fighting ISIS in Iraq, and they're also Hezbollah is fighting ISIS in Syria proper. So it's but it's mixed up because we're allied with the Iranian militias in Iraq fighting against ISIS, but we're against Hezbollah militias in Syria fighting ISIS.
Yeah, then you have the mix of the Sunnis against the Shia, and the main thing for the United States is to get rid of Assad, but Russia and Iran would be interested in keeping Assad and protecting the Shia.
Or not removing him at least.
Right,
not actively
right, at
removing,
least, right.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Well, I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. This is a mess over here, and it's a good question to ask about what is the nature of ISIS. To say that ISIS doesn't exist, I don't think that is accurate because it exists in our minds. But to understand how it came about and what they're doing, whose side they're on, and what the motivation is a bigger challenge. You know, all this could be settled. We wouldn't have to try to sort out the nitty-gritty and find out who's on which side, because we just shouldn't be there. None of this happened before we got rid of Saddam Hussein, and before we got involved in Afghanistan, and before we started getting involved in these revolutions, and certainly before we decided to declare war against Assad in 2011. They say, well, we should declare war against ISIS now. Well, what is it to say Assad must go? That's like a declaration of war. So it's chaos, and then all of a sudden we have this really bizarre support from the West and maybe from our own government to support ISIS, and it makes no sense whatsoever. It will not solve the problem over there. The problems are going to get much worse. There's going to be a lot of expenses, a lot more people killed, and a lot more unintended consequences that nobody can accurately predict. But one thing for sure, peace is not likely to break out soon, and the American people ought to stop and think, well, we can't be engaged like this and say, well, no American is ever going to die. And the neocons would agree with that statement. Yes, we must. We even have candidates saying now, not only should we start bombing, we shouldn't be so bashful about it, and we have to expect to kill civilians too. That is a war mentality that we don't need. We need to be thinking more about what brings about peace and peace and prosperity in the world. And it's a long way different than from our economic and our foreign policy that we're following today. It's time to change both of those policies. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today, and thank you, and come back soon to the Liberty Report.
Ron Paul Liberty Report on YouTube, RonPaulLibertyReport.com. Subscribe, support. When we look at what's going on in Syria, the rise of ISIS, it's something that, from all evidence that's popped up, kind of suggests that, hey, it looks like we knowingly allowed this to happen because of an agenda that we were after, that the end results will justify the means, creating, basically allowing these religious extremists, is how I would really put it. Just like the KKK could be looked at as, religious extremists. You look at ISIS and you look at one of the leaders. One of the leaders that just happened to meet with McCain because he was one of those moderate rebels that we should help out. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. The first part of his name is the name that he's taken. and his alias, basically, what he goes by. And the original Abu Bakr was a advisor to Muhammad, and he came to rise to kind of take charge after Muhammad died, and he launched a caliphate. So whether people want to admit it, there was a religious backing behind these people. There's motivation. Whether all of the people joining ISIS originally had that religious they're being indoctrinated into it. They're being, by the success of ISIS, that empowers that. Look what he's doing. He's successfully creating a caliphate. And this is really a bigger issue because they have their motivation and their agenda, but what it's being used for is destabilization, and there's a reason behind that. And I've talked about this before, and I talked about it. It shows that they're pushing people out of that region. It's a forced migration. Why? Because they need to destabilize the West. They are trying to completely end capitalism in their minds. Well, many of the activists and the people that are brainwashed into this, what they're really angry about is, corporatism or crony capitalism. So they give up more and more rights and more of their wealth in the name of taxing the rich more. Does that ever end up happening? Well, it eventually will when you watch that point teeter and finally tip. And when it does, that's when you'll see governments clamp down. And I think this Paris attack was the beginning of that. With technology where it's at, with the militarization of law enforcement all over the West, there is a global war brewing. And we have the whole Middle East being destabilized. We have people calling on, we got to stop these terrorists and these terror attacks, giving up their rights. And what you also have is Russia and the U.S. kind of playing power struggle. What you're going to see, and really you should already be seeing it across the world, but just imagine, Russia and the U.S., socialists fighting against maybe, I'd say communists, but I would even say more fascists, because fascists tend to be more nationalist. And you see that with Russia. What you're going to see is kind of a socialist, multi-nation socialist, which always leads to communism of some sort, a authoritarian government. And it's going to be a war of authoritarian governments. And they got technology out there that really should start worrying people. Because if this breaks off into a World War III, any opposition to your side, even though it might not be your side. You might even just claim neutral, but you're not supporting, you're not being patriotic. We're going to see all of that. But when, most of you think patriotic, yeah, about America and the Constitution. No. About America and the socialist fight for equality. And equality is not as nice as it sounds. That means no matter how extent your talent may be, you're no better and are of no more worth than the lazy person that goes, hey, I can not do my job right and still get paid. Which then leads to a more authoritarian government that wants to crack down and force labor. And, we go back into the dark ages. Right now we have a war on free speech. We have authoritarian governments cracking down, doubling down on problems that they helped create, which is leading to this really a global war. China's just kind of over there kind of doing its thing, telling us to stay away from their man-made islands, and they're not really engaging, but they're also looking to take the world currency for themselves, meaning they are going to now be the holders of the world currency if they get their way. Even though China and Russia might have tensions, they tend to seem to be working together with this, and I think a lot of Putin's strategical things are kind of keeping America's attention. We have a legitimate threat with ISIS and their holy war because they really believe that that's what they're engaged in. Then you have a large amount of a lot of people in the Kurdish region that are fighting ISIS too. So that just furthers, this is a holy war. Even if the rest of the world isn't looking at it like that, they are. And it's pretty evident when they, are quoting things and saying that's what's justifying them. So whether even other Muslims go, that's not a true holy war. It's not what you think. It's what those people think in their head. So you have to understand it from where they're looking at it from. And I think that's getting more evident to most people, but that doesn't mean that Muslims are bad. But there's something going on where this extremism, and I do believe foreign policy has played a part in this. If you have a country say, we're going to free you from your dictator, and you come in and bomb them, and innocents are just lost everywhere, and then you have groups like ISIS running Christians and others running for their lives, you tend to kind of empower a dislike for America, and then when it can be manipulated into the holy war, it's usually not good to fulfill prophecies of another culture so perfectly, it seems. Seems like they're going, yeah, well, if we do this, this will send this message. And they're going to start a holy war. I don't actually think it was that intentional, but um, we do have a problem here, and we're seeing it here in America. I'm trying to find this article. I seen it on Breitbart. Might not be able to find it now. Yeah, I'm not seeing it right here. Um, I believe I do have it bookmarked here, though. I'd rather bring it up on my phone because you don't have all the ad pop-up crap, but okay. Gun sales, concealed permit applications surge after Paris attacks. In the days since heinous terror attacks in Paris took 130 innocent lives and wounded, hundreds more Americans have flooded into gun stores to purchase new guns and sign up for concealed carry permit classes in their respective states. And those buying guns include many who have never owned a gun before. For example, Fox News San Antonio quoted Texas gun owners Jerry McCall saying he has seen people in their 70s and 80s who said that they have never owned a firearm before but think they need one in the house now. And people who might have purchased their first gun ever during the last year amid the unrest and anxiety of the Ferguson protests or the Baltimore riots are now buying a second gun to be sure they can protect their families in the event of an attack. Mary Hernandez is one such customer. She said she and her husband bought their first gun last year and are shopping for their second in the wake of the Paris attacks. She and her husband feel that they can never be too protective. Hernandez observed, I don't want to be with my kids and my family hiding under a table. I want to be protecting us and get us out of there if I had to try to stop somebody. Amid WSFA reports, the gun store in Alabama are seeing the same kind of run. Russell Durling owns Last Resort Guns in Madison County and said, we were busy right out of the box following the attacks. The truth is, when America is scared, America buys guns, he added. In addition to the gun sales, store owners are seeing a surge in concealed carry permit applications, course attendance as well. Concealed classes at Texas Guns have doubled in the last week, and the Limestone, Alabama Sheriff's Office reports witnessing its biggest spike in permits after the attacks on Friday. That was out of Breitbart. Now, of course, we have Obama says gun control to be top issue of final year out of Washington Times. And I hate Washington Times when it comes to trying to pull up anything. They got more ads popping up and there's quite a few websites out there like that. President Obama hopes to make gun control the top issue of his final year in office, saying Americans aren't more violent than other people, but they have more deadly weapons to act out their rage. In an interview published Tuesday in GQ magazine, Mr. Obama said easy access to guns is the only variable between the U.S. and other developed countries. We become more and more like other countries where there are a lot of people that don't own guns. There's a lot of fear about guns, and it's made us less safe. France, you had to wait for guys with guns. And usually when fewer people have the access to guns, the people that do have the access to guns run more of a muck. So government is allowed to become more corrupt because it's the only ones with the guns. They fear nothing after that. You know, you look at how many guns are in America. That is why he wants gun control. And he is vowed to go after that. Wonder where Paul Ryan's going to fall into this. I want to get to... I have a couple clips here. The first one I want to get to is the Ben Swan reality check. Did Australia and Great Britain see lower gun violence? And this was posted a couple days ago. So.
Only days after that mass shooting at the community college in Oregon, President Obama said that the United States needs to follow the lead of Great Britain and Australia, nations that instituted large-scale gun bans and gun confiscation after mass shootings on their soil. Would it work here? Maybe the more important question, did it work there? It's a reality check you won't see anywhere else.
We know that other countries, in response to one mass shooting, have been able to craft laws that almost eliminate mass shootings. Friends of ours, allies of ours, Great Britain, Australia, countries like ours.
That was President Obama speaking shortly after the community college shooting in Oregon. The president says that Great Britain and Australia are great examples of nations that have taken control of gun violence. But are they? It made me think, what is the real story behind those countries? Let's start with Great Britain. On August 19, 1987, Michael Ryan killed 15 people and wounded 15 others in a series of random shootings around Hungerford, Berkshire. He also killed his mother before taking his own life. The pistol and 2 semi-automatic rifles that he used in that massacre were all owned legally. Well, as a result, Great Britain enacted some of the world's strictest gun control measures in the late 80s and 90s. In Britain, a nation of 63 million people, more than 200,000 guns and 700 tons of ammunition have been taken off the streets over the past 15 years. So what has the result been? Well, early on, the ban appeared to have little impact, as the number of crimes involving guns in England and Wales rose heavily during the late 1990s to peak at 24,094 in 2003-2004. Since 2004, though, the numbers of crimes involving guns has actually fallen each year. In 2010 to 2011, there were 11,227 offenses, 53% below that peak number. And again, all of those numbers began to fall long after gun bans were put into place. And that's also not to say that the ban ended mass shootings in Great Britain, because it did not. In 2010, a lone gunman killed 12 people in a 4-hour shooting spree in northern England. So what about Australia? Well, this is a more dramatic example. In 1996, a 28-year-old man killed 35 people with a semi-automatic rifle in the Tasmanian city of Port Arthur. 12 days later, a gun confiscation program was rushed through the Australian Parliament. The National Agreement on Firearms all but prohibited automatic and semi-automatic assault rifles. It stiffened licensing and it stiffened ownership rules. It also instituted a temporary gun buyback program that took some 650,000 so-called assault weapons, about 1/6 of the national stock, out of public circulation. The images are pretty incredible from that time. This agreement was called a gun buyback, but it really wasn't. It was mandatory. So what were the effects of the program? Well, interestingly, there have been at least 2 major studies done on the program and gun homicides. The first was done by the University of Melbourne researchers Wang Shen Li and Sandy Sarardi. In 2008, they completed a report on this matter, and it said this, quote, "In this paper, we reanalyzed the same data on firearm deaths used in previous research, using tests for unknown structural breaks as a means to identifying impacts of the National Firearms Agreement. The results of these tests suggest that the NFA did not have any large effects on reducing firearm homicide or suicide rates." And a second report concluded that while the mandatory program did reduce the rate of accidental firearm deaths, it had no influence on a firearm homicide in Australia. It also did not end mass shootings. In 2002, 2 people were killed, 5 were injured in a shooting at Melbourne's Monash University. In 2011, 3 people were killed, 3 were wounded in the Hectorville siege. And in 2014, 3 people, including the gunman, were killed and 4 others injured in a Sydney hostage crisis. So what you need to know is that even with mass confiscation of weapons, Australia could not end all mass shootings, and the rate of gun homicides wasn't actually affected. But here's something else worth mentioning. The 650,000 guns confiscated in Australia, that was between 1/5 and 1/3 of all the guns in the entire country. Let's compare that now to the United States. To do the same thing here, that would require confiscation of around 105 million firearms, something that would not only be unconstitutional, but would likely become incredibly violent. In other words, mass confiscation in the United States simply cannot happen. Not right now, and possibly not ever. That's Reality Check. Let's talk about that tonight on Twitter.
TruthOfMedia.com, Ben Swan, Reality Report, Truth of Media on YouTube too. Go there and subscribe. And he's perfectly right when he says it will be violent. Like the Breitbart pointed out the article there, you know, every time Americans get scared, gun sales go up. That is because there is something deep rooted in America about defending yourself. That Britain, Europe have lost. And they have allowed themselves to feed in this fallacy of this united EU kingdom, but they're now seeing where France is affected. France is taking action. But the problem is France is continuing something. What they should have done is said, we'll help the countries out, rather than fight ISIS and fight Assad. You can't play both sides of this and win. The problem is there is an end game. You can't tell me that all these leaders of Germany, France, Great Britain, you can't tell me that they are completely, dumb to the point where they don't realize what's happening with the influx of these refugees. That you can't tell me that they don't know that there are bad people that are coming across those borders intent on disrupting the culture, the heritage of all the Western world, which they have blatantly said that, that is what they plan to do. They have called France Rome because, again, it kind of goes back towards the caliphate. Again, it's a holy war for them. But in the broader scope, it's the beginning of a world war and a world depression. The rationing. Things are going to get harder for everyone, except the very, very few elite that will be able to just bounce around. And I'm sure some of them will be stabbed in the back by the other elites so they can ensure their freedom. And, being someone that since a little kid has been into history, it seems a repeat. It really does. Doesn't seem like, if you remember history and you looked into history pretty deep, it's like deja vu. Like, are they meaningfully doing this? Well, I think the socialist extremists are. They are trying to transform the Western world. Under a freer concept, the Western world was able to flourish, to be that beacon that brought people, to the U.S., to Europe, made it a tourist destination. And now it's slowly becoming a hindrance to their acquisition of power. They have allowed corporatism to take over. Therefore, when you allow corporatism, when mistakes are made, the monopoly system that ends up happening under corporatism, which a lot of terms you'll hear for that is a regulated monopoly. It allows for these mistakes to be more dangerous and backed by government and covered up by government. Where, well, we will investigate and make them pay for cleanup. And of course, it looks like it tends, for the most part, to be we kind of cleaned it up, but the effects are going to be seen for a good 5-10 years, 20 years. Fukushima, who knows how long that'll be affecting the ocean. And then it allows for the call for socialism. Because people go, well, I should be able to, do what I want to do, but I can either go in debt where I can't pay my bills because I can't get a good enough job after I go to college and get out. The market's saturated with college degrees. and the economy is not doing good. Or I can work right out of high school, get a job, make okay money, pay the bills, but not be able to save back for more than maintenance on a house just to keep the water heater needs replaced. The faucet broke. The roof needs replaced. The siding's getting bad. I need to paint the house. It becomes a thing where people don't feel they can move up in society unless they make the one discovery that the one Facebook or the one Twitter. There are a lot of people in the United States and in the world, and not all of them go, hey, we all can be the next Facebook. So they call for this more of a socialist society where, he got lucky with Facebook. He shouldn't be able to be that wealthy. He should give up his money. And it's funny because these people like Zuckerberg tend to lean more towards the socialist side, the authoritarian side. Because they've been comforted in the corporatist lifestyle. But the more socialist we get, the more he will be allowed to be kind of that front man, the public figure guy, which I don't think he really wants to be. He seems kind of shyish, kind of lonerish. But they're going to end up taking wealth. And they will eventually take it all until it's gone. There's no production left to build up wealth. That means the path that we're on is going to be things that we've seen out of movies where we really just have ghettos just everywhere. And of course, the more authoritarian they get, the more they want to push the people into confined and more confined areas so they are easily controlled. They take control of natural resources. Why is all that important? Well, all that's linked to Agenda 21. What this means is it also allows for them to continue to create and condense governmental duties into a more centralized control. If they weren't able to create the Amero, they are getting closer to it. When I say the Amero, I'm talking about they don't need the countries of Canada, the United States, Mexico to get any closer to a EU-style government if they already can get all three of them to sign on with a North American and European alliance. Why is that important? Well, if they have to battle China and Russia, they're going to feel that they need more of an alliance. I think this whole battle will take Africa and South America into their own alliance. Where all the borders could be drawn, it's a toss of the coin, but the thing I don't see coming out of this is any side fighting for actual freedom. This will be a authoritarian world war. What power structure can be the strongest and use its assets, aka you, to the best potential? And that means everything's open, just like what we've seen with Hitler and using methamphetamine basically to blitzkrieg. And it's getting scary out there, and I think all of that is very noticeable just by looking at the extremes that we have running for president. Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, Jeb Bush. Do we really? Rubio? Paul Ryan took Boehner's spot. What was the point of that? They are, I think, too, sending a signal that they're not going to let control fall out of the hands of government. So I wanted to get to this clip here before I forget, if I can find it. Maybe. Maybe not. Now, this was from We Are Change. Bernie Sanders' campaign confronted on supporting Syrian rebels. Tune this down here.
I talked to Ed Schultz, former MSNBC host and now a full-time campaigner for Bernie Sanders. I asked him about Bernie Sanders' controversial stance on arming the so-called Syrian rebels, which was a disastrous program by Barack Obama, which he supported, that actually not only was a huge waste of money, but the weapons and training actually all came to al-Nusra and ISIS. Here's his response.
Now, the Iraq war was a big topic of discussion today, and yes, Bernie did vote against those wars, but he did not vote against, and he supported the bombing of Gaza, Kosovo, Libya, Afghanistan, and Syria. Does he truly believe that war is the last resort when he voted and supported these conflicts?
Yeah, because fighting terrorism is a big thing. About the Kosovo, when Clinton was president, that was as much a moral obligation as it was anything else. And he supported the administration on that at that time. And I think that his narrative of getting a coalition together and getting the Arab world to address their own regional problems first and not have the United States come in. I think that's where the American people are. We can't afford another conflict in the Middle East. It's going to have to be a team effort if we're going to reel in what we're facing right now globally.
In hindsight, was it okay for Bernie to support the overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya and the support of rebels in Syria with everything we know is happening now?
But we didn't have international intervention on Libya. There were no American troops used on Libya. There were some support operations that were given, but it was not the kind of operation that we had in Iraq or Afghanistan. And I think that's what his distinction is.
But is Libya stable now or unstable because of the intervention?
That's to be debated. But what do the American people want? The American people voted for Barack Obama to get us out of Iraq and to get us out of these wars in Afghanistan and to protect the country. And that's where the country is right now. The country's not into, what do you say we put 500,000 troops into Syria to straighten out their civil war problem? That's not where it's at. The number one priority is to protect the country.
But has he done that when Free Syrian Army and the moderate rebels have turned over their weapons and guns and intelligence over to al-Nusra? ISIS is fighting with U.S. weapons intelligence. They have Toyota trucks, for God's sakes.
Well,
and the U.S.
You're asking a presidential question. Bernie Sanders doesn't have the authority that the President of the United States has. The question you're asking should be directed towards President Obama, shouldn't it?
Yes, but he did support the funding of Syria, in Syria and in Libya, and we have both destroyed those countries because of those political decisions. Those are huge decisions that have pretty much destroyed the Middle East.
I would not agree with you that we have destroyed those countries. So that the premise of your question is definitive that we have done something wrong. We didn't tell the Libyan people to oppose Gaddafi. And oh, by the way, Gaddafi did have American blood on his hands with the bombing at Lockerbie, which finally he was held accountable for.
Of course, obviously Ed was a little frustrated from our conversation, and he tried to tell me that I should have asked President Barack Obama this question. No, U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders, as of October of this year, said he's in support of this disastrous program, which luckily has ended. He actually voted against it in the Senate, but now is for it, which makes no sense at all. In Libya, let's look at Libya. Because of direct U.S. foreign policy, because of direct bombing of his convoy, the rebels that we trained came in and assassinated him in the streets. Now Libya is filled with sectarian violence and the rise of extremism. How would Syria look right now if the United States was not funneling money and weapons into that country just to get rid of Assad, arming the very enemy that we're supposed to be fighting? You have to ask these hard questions, and you have to stand up against any ideology, against any candidate or elected official that you believe you like, and because I know there's probably a bunch of Bernie Sanders supporters on this channel, and we're not going to cater to you, because the truth is the truth. It's more important than anything else, and to really solve the problems in this world, we have to face it. Thank you for watching real independent media, supporting us, because YouTube again.
We are change. We are change.org. We are change on YouTube. Subscribe. Now, we again know that this seemed to have been called out ahead of time that this is the way it was going to go down. These things would happen by arming the so-called rebels. So we go ahead and do it. It seems a lot of this is being done on purpose. Well, what did we see during the whole Paris attacks? We've seen New York City's anti-terror squad come out looking like military. We had military on the streets of Paris. Another article out of Breitbart, German army could be deployed to streets for first time since 1945. We have first curfew in France since 1942, I believe. London police chief calls for more armed officers out of Breitbart. We have Jordan's King Abdullah II. Quote, we are facing a third world war against ISIS. And of course, we have Shakowski Paris attack chilling. Reminder, we need gun control. We give ISIS gun. We give Mexican drug cartels guns, but we shouldn't have guns. We give people that we know, or we knowingly know that they're going to end up with these more than likely, or you're just not that far-sighted, I guess. But we shouldn't have guns. So we had Paris that was unarmed. Except for the guys that show up after something bad's happened. But the citizens weren't armed. More than likely, those weapons probably, more than likely, were funneled from Syria. Maybe not. But again, it's about using all of this to gain more and more power. And being a libertarian, I would be for open borders. But when we talk about open borders, really we're talking about governmental controlled borders. We're talking still about a welfare state. A corporate welfare, welfare for the immigrants, refugees, migrants, whatever. And again, the end goal is to gain more power. And I really, again, think we are coming to a pivotal point in history. And I think it depends on how many people are awake to the idea of freedom and liberty. Now, let me get this article up here. Sorry. A little issue here. Okay, I think it's starting to pull up here. Okay, here it is. This one was from Sputnik. Paris adopts measures similar to U.S. Patriot Act. For the sake of the European Union's survival, France and Europe in general should drastically rethink its failed policies. It says, in response to the Paris attacks, the French government has adopted authoritarian measures strikingly similar to those implemented by George W. Bush in the wake of 9/11 tragedy. French journalist and political analyst Gilbert Mercier remarks, the November 13th attack in Paris has shocked the world and prompted the French government to enact tough measures to ensure security. However, the authoritarian actions are unlikely to solve the country's long-standing socio-economic problems, apparently lying at the root of the latest hideous attack or assault. French journalist, author, and geopolitical analysis Gilbert Mercier underscores the French government's reaction was both panicked and swift, and it immediately embraced repressive authoritarian measures similar to those that had been set up by the Bush administration in the aftermath of 9/11. Just like 9/11 in the United States, it seems that the way France's Bloody Friday will be exploited matters more than the tragedy itself, Mercer wrote in his recent article for a News Junkie post. There is no better justification to crack down on civil liberty, freedom, and other principles that define the essence of democracy than the good old permanent global war on terror, the French author added with a trace of a bitter irony. The journalist underscores that the Hollande administration has immediately issued a number of orders, including declaration of nationwide state of emergency and the introduction of tighter controls at French borders. Parisians were given instructions to stay home while heavy armed police, SWAT teams, and military occupied the street. Mercer called attention to the fact that a decree strikingly similar to the U.S. Patriot Act was hastily adopted to authorize the search for potential culprits in all buildings and private residences. The decree also allows the preemptive arrest without probable cause of any individual deemed by French authorities to be suspect or dangerous. French author underscored, adding that the term dangerous is a vague and elastic and could potentially apply to political descendants. Why should that matter? I'll tell you why, because just look at Le Pen. Over remarks, not because of any physical action, because of remarks when it came to immigration. Whether you believe in Le Pen, definitely a radical, but look at the radical Merkel. Again, this looks to be a grouping of socially minded and authoritarian minded Western countries coming together to push authoritarian measures to gain their political agendas. And World War III will be their excuse to clamp down domestically in all of these countries. That's why this is important right now. To understand what they're going to be pushing for. And it needs to be exposed. But we also are running into an issue there. Hopefully I can find it. Might not be able to because Drudge updates pretty good. I don't think I'm going to find it. Not there. Let's see if Truth and Media has it. Not seeing it there. I definitely want to find this. I thought I bookmarked it, but guess I didn't. You remember Drudge was recently on InfoWars. We have European Commission attack on Drudge in the hyperlink. That was out of InfoWars November 9th because of a proposed EU law. I'll bring that one up, but it'll take a minute. I'll get into that. But this one was October 25th. Drudge beware, FEC joins attack on internet free speech. There's a series, and this is out of the Independent Sentinel. There is a serious and multi-pronged effort by Democrats to restrict the free speech of individuals and groups. The latest is planned by the FEC to regulate free online political sites to include free YouTube postings and blogs like Drudge and Sean Hannity. Free speech on the internet has not been regulated, but Democrats want to regulate it. It's an enormous overreach by government. The FEC does not legitimately have the power to regulate free speech on the internet. All blogs, videos, and internet sites would be affected by a move at the FEC to add burdensome regulations. Democratic FEC Vice Chairman Ann M. Ravel wants regulations that would treat them like PACs. Until now, they have been free of most FEC rules. The effort was blocked by 3 Republicans, but Ravel has promised to bring it back with full force next year. They got some links there too to other articles, independentsentinel.com. This one out at InfoWars, European Commission attack on Drudge and the hyperlink. Proposed EU law puts simple active linking to content under copyright protection. And remember, the TPP will play a big part in all this. EU or chicks are working on a ancillary copyright law that will threaten websites like Drudge Report and Infowars.com. The European Commission is preparing a frontal attack on the hyperlink, the basic building block of the internet as we know it. This is based on an absurd idea that just won't die, making search engines and news portals pay media companies for promoting their freely accessible articles, writes Julia Reda, a German activist from the Pirate Party and a member of the European Parliament. Rita cites a draft communication on copyright reform leaked last week. The document proposes putting a simple act of linking to content under copyright protection. This idea flies in the face of both existing interpretation and spirit of the law as well as common sense. Each web link would become a legal landmine and would allow press publishers to hold every single actor on the internet liable. Retta explains she believes the EU will introduce ancillary copyright and internet restrictions under the guise of clearing up questions left unanswered by the Svensson case. In the Svensson case, the European Court of Justice determined that simply linking content is not infringement. Bringing in a EU-wide Google tax in a misguided attempt to prop up publishers that still haven't figured out how to work with rather than against the internet would be disastrous, writes Glenn Moody for TechDirt. On October 6th, Matt Drudge told Alex Jones Show that the very foundation of the free internet is under severe threat from copyright laws that could ban independent media outlets. I had a Supreme Court justice tell me it's over for me, said Drudge. They've got the votes now to enforce copyright law. You're out of there. They're going to make it so you can't even use headlines. And that was out of Infowars.com. So there is a major attack going on any opposition to the agenda that's being pushed. Now I try to find this. Sorry, it's not wanting to come up. Sorry. Always having issues. Okay. got reloading here, so it should pop up. Now, this clip, I'm not going to play the whole thing. We don't have enough time to play the whole thing. But with what's going on right now in the world, the U.S. dollar, that piece of paper, when we imagine where we're going with that dollar, it doesn't seem that we're going in a good direction. Because even though you do see prices drop a little bit, definitely with this whole, you know, Saudis pumping oil out of the ground like it's going out of style, the flooding of the market of the oil, there's also another problem coming ahead, and that's the threat of this world war, which I think we're already experiencing the beginning of. And getting away from the dollar, I think, is going to be important in multiple aspects, whether it's food supply, you know, self-reliance, gold, silver. Before we get into this clip, I want to remind people to support UCY. Go to ucy.tv. There's a UCY support tab at the top, and you can donate and help out alternative media that way. You can also scroll down to the bottom. There's a donate tab and also a Amazon store tab. If you click that Amazon button right there, you can shop Amazon and check out all the great deals that they got, great shipping rates, and buy some of your preparedness deals through that. And you're helping us support UCY.TV so that all the great broadcasts can make it out there to you, so you have the information to go forward and prepare for the future. Another way, if you want to get some non-GMO seeds, great seed vaults, medicinal seed, herbal seed vaults, your regular herbal seed vault, and your crisis garden seed vaults. Check out My Patriot Supply. If you go to antityrannynews.com/mypatriot, it'll take you to My Patriot Supply, get the same great deals, and you're also helping support this broadcast. And for gold and silver, I personally found Amagi metals to be one of the best deals I could find out there. And even though the price of gold and silver is down, the demand for it's up. What does that mean? That means there is a lot of preparedness going on right now. There is acknowledgement of something major coming down the road. And they don't have the supply like they had 2 years ago, a year ago. In the past year, their supply has gotten pretty limited, so has others. But they still have gold, silver at low prices. Excuse me. If you go to antityrannynews.com/metal, when you buy gold through Amagi Metal and that link, you will also be helping support this broadcast. Now, I want to get into this, and this was Jeffrey Tucker, Liberty Classics, the denaturalization of money. And whether you're a Bitcoin person, electronic type person, or kind of more my way, which I still think that Bitcoin is an option. It's something that people should look at. I tend to lean a little bit more into physical gold and silver, but again, I don't ever wage everything in one place. Don't ever put all your eggs in one basket. And this clip won't, again, be able to play all of it, but play a decent portion of it. And it really gets into the nationalization of money and how that will lead to what we come out of in this transition that you're seeing going on throughout the world, where we are kind of moving in that volatile state. So I believe it to be important to not hold something that won't be recognized around the world. Bitcoin, gold, silver is being recognized around the world. So I think that is important. So here we go. Let's go ahead and get into this.
Welcome, my Liberty.me friends and other friends that are watching for our Sunday night book discussion. Tonight we're talking about Hayek's Denationalization of Money, a 1974 book that really represented the culmination of this man's ideas. He had been thinking about money for his entire career. Back in the 1920s, he was writing with Mises as his top guy at the Institute for Business Cycle Research. He wrote some large monographs about the subject. He moved to Britain, published Prices and Production, Monetary Theory and the Trade Cycle, several other books on money, became a kind of a global phenomenon, something of an alternative to John Maynard Keynes. And like Mises, Hayek was interested in reform. He was interested in reforming the monetary system, very much like what you see today in the Republican Party. I don't know how many of you watched the debates over the last several weeks, but I think twice now they've been asked about monetary policy. Thank goodness, right? I mean, it's the most recent debate, which is by far the most intelligent of all the debates. The Wall Street Journal Fox News debate, is the most recent one, asked a specific question about monetary policy. Would you reappoint Janet Yellen? What is your view of Fed policy? And that's exciting. I mean, there needs to be some discussion of this topic because, the Fed is the way Leviathan grows. It's the printing press that enables terrible policies that we have out there. If it weren't for the Fed, war would not be a consideration. We wouldn't be able to maintain deficits like this. If federal bonds were not backed by the Fed, they would have a default risk like any other private bond or municipal bond for that matter. And the equation would change dramatically. They would, people wouldn't just hold them with such confidence, and the default risk wouldn't be what they are. I mean, they're rated ridiculously high. The world would be a very different place without Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve sort of makes many, many debates in Washington irrelevant. I mean, there's no fiscal discipline because, federal government's too big to fail, and everybody knows it. So, yeah, reform of the Fed is important. It's not just about reforming monetary policy, and it's not about, what goes on at the next federal open market committee meeting. Should interest rates be raised? Should they be lowered? That's really not the issue. The problem is, and it's an unavoidable problem, the existence of the Fed itself as the lender of last resort for the entire American empire. The government, the banking system, and everything associated with it. So it's not just about the policies that it adopts. It's about its existence and its corrupting effects on the fiscal and political life of this nation. So it's an impossible thing to avoid discussing. Should there be a Fed? Why do we need a Fed? If there is going to be a Fed, we could argue about what it should do, but the discussion about eliminating it, getting rid of it, its necessity, its non-necessity, to me, is the unavoidable question. Everything else is just mop-up operations. I mean, it's just argument about, small details. So Ron Paul used to argue for the abolition of the Fed, although he was always careful to, avoid putting in a specific plan to get from here to there. He wanted an old-fashioned gold standard, which would be very difficult to implement, actually. The other problem with all kind of reform plans like that is that they depend on the complicity or compliance or the enthusiasm of the establishment. You have to get the Fed and all of its benefactors to go along with that, which, quite frankly, was never going to happen. That's a great problem with all plans to reform the Fed. Anyway, so the candidates were asked about this. And I think Rand Paul gave the best, he could have just said, look, we don't need a central bank. Let's abolish it. Could have said that. No, he probably believes that. Instead, he took the tack of saying the Fed should not be controlling interest rates any more than the government itself ought to be controlling prices, since interest rates are the price of money. It was a good answer. It was good. He talked about the Fed as responsible for the rise of inequality. And that was interesting because all the candidates were asked a question about inequality. Is it a problem? Is it not? And Rand used the occasion. He said, well, it's not possible to talk about wealth inequality without talking about the 1% as being essentially clients of the Federal Reserve, by which he meant, I'm not sure he explained it as well as he might have, by which he meant the Wall Street banking firms and bond dealers and large-scale financial companies that are dependent on inflationary finance. So, yeah, there's a decent answer. He could have explained it a little bit more, but it was, it's okay. And then the other guy was Ted Cruz, who seems very uncomfortable talking about the issue of money, actually. But he condemned the arbitrariness, Star Chamber of the Federal Reserve. He echoed some populist language about the Star Chamber. Oh, they're operating in secret and blah blah blah. We need a gold standard, he said. He said we need a more stable, predictable, solid, firmly rooted Federal Reserve policy, ideally tied to gold, I think he said. It was a kind of a meandering comment. I'm not sure he has any clue what he's talking about, but that's what he said. He's sort of throwing out buzzwords to capture the constituents. That it's nice to think there's a constituency out there that wants to reform the money. I'm not sure how big it is, but anyway. And then Kasich, I don't know if you remember this from the debate, weighed in with a funny comment. He said, the worst thing that could ever happen is for Congress to control monetary policy. Now, that was an interesting comment because nobody had actually proposed that Congress control monetary policy instead of the Federal Reserve. It's not like either the Fed runs the world or Congress runs the world by printing money through the Treasury Department. I mean, that's not actually the choices that are out there. As far as I know, there is a third choice, right? But Kasich, is rather sophisticated and knows that a great deal of the bipartisanship associated with attacking the Fed, it's weird. It's like it's split in two parts. Half the people want sound money, gold standard, tight money, hard money, restrain the Fed, take away its power, and make the dollar good as gold or make it rooted in something real, blah, blah, blah. Or maybe this sort of Chicago style quantitative control, quantity theory of money. So you just raise it on a specific level according to some standard, whether it's nominal GDP or whatever it is. Just, have the Fed adhere to a certain standard. That's one camp, and then the other camp is the populist left that hates the guts of the Federal Reserve. Not because they're too loose, but because they're not loose enough, right? So Kasich knows this. This coalition has always been working together to kind of like audit the Fed or, harass the Fed or, integrate the Fed or, just denounce the Fed or whatever. But they have two totally different perspectives on what the problem is. One side says too loose. The other side says not loose enough. And the people that say not loose enough, I mean, they're basically the successors to the old silver movement from the 1880s, the popular silver movement from the 1880s and 1890s. They're sympathetic with the debtor class. I just think government ought to print endless amounts of money, or in the case of the free silver movement, just base the dollar on silver, not gold, and have endless inflation. That this is the way to free the debtors from the control of the banking class or whatever. So a lot of the critics of the Fed come from the far left. I mean, this is why Ron Paul and Bernie Sanders used to work together on Fed legislation. But this is an uncomfortable mix because, under those conditions, let's say, they both agree, put their fingers on the plug and pull it on the Fed. What happens then? You got half the people wanting Congress to control it and create a Weimar-style inflation, which is in fact what would happen, and the other half wanting to tie the dollar to gold, which would create a hardcore, extreme deflationary policy that would, radically change everything about federal finance and Wall Street and the functioning of the world. I mean, these are opposite, points of view. I don't know what to compare it to. But anyway, they're completely different camps. And so Kasich was warning when he said the worst eventuality he could imagine was Congress controlling monetary policy. He's referring to the populist left-wing critics of the Fed, like Bernie Sanders and like many, many others in Congress who have tended to join with the audit the Fed movement. I mean, we don't talk about this much, but it's a very mixed movement and a very mixed bag. Which one will prevail in the end? I don't know. We'll probably never see the reform happen at all. And why is that? It's because monetary policy is controlled, by the elites, and they're not going to listen to. I mean, there's nothing that a President Cruz or a President Paul could do to reform the Fed. I mean, they could call a commission, maybe, but yeah, and they can throw out nominations for the Federal Open Market Committee memberships and that sort of thing, but there's really not a tool in place that they can use to cause Federal Reserve policy to be exactly what they want it to be. And plus, I don't believe these guys are competent enough to do this. I mean, they don't really know what they're doing. They don't really even know what they're talking about. Well, this gets us back to Hayek. And I say all this to set the stage because I think we need to appreciate just how incredibly radical Hayek's denationalization of money monograph really is. So he, like so many of his contemporaries, from Haberler to Schumpeter to Machlup to, there were so many. Just many, many dozens, and, hundreds probably, economists around the world from the interwar period coming up to modern times had argued for radical reform of the money because, let's face it, the end of the gold standard in World War I, which is what unraveled the gold standard for the entire Western world, was a disaster. It was a disaster for the rise of Leviathan. It was a disaster for budget deficits, human liberty, everything. Central banking was a calamity, creating unrelenting inflation and business cycles, and like I say, bolstering government growth. Something that had been warned about, let's face it, for centuries. You can read it back in Adam Smith. Adam Smith talks about the danger of government control of money, that it leads to inflation, business booms and busts, and an expansion of the state. It's right there in Wealth of Nations. This is not unknown, and you can go back hundreds of years earlier to the works of the late scholastics, Spanish economists, and see that people have warned against debasement of money. So this is a very old concern, and Hayek and his contemporaries had argued for reform of the money. World War II came. There was no reform. Things just got worse. Bretton Woods followed. Came immediately after the war. Who ran that? Who was in charge of that? That was, of course, John Maynard Keynes. So they were very, this whole generation was just enormously depressed about the situation. One quick second. Bretton Woods fell apart, as you know. Gold was flying out to have a unified monetary policy requires a unified fiscal policy, as we're discovering in Europe. Bretton Woods imagined a world on the dollar standard, and the dollar itself would be internationally redeemable in gold without any attempt to kind of control fiscal policy. So once the fiscal imbalances came along and central banks began to operate in different ways, the gold outflows from the U.S. were getting so intense. Richard Nixon finally just shut the gold window and started this unprecedented experience, which he thought would lead to global stability and end of inflation and end of business cycles. Following the advice of the monetarists to eliminate finally the gold from the monetary system altogether. And it was in this context, the sense of despair and disgust and really outrage and demoralization, shock, and really horror that Hayek writes this monograph. And what he says here is, look, this is absurd. This is ridiculous. Government has no incentive whatsoever to reform the money. The central banks have their interest in keeping their power. The banks love the central bank. The government loves the central bank. The large financial dealers love the bond dealers, and a large financial house loves central bank. The entire ruling class is living off this central banking racket. It's never going to come to an end. They haven't paid attention to us. By us, I mean sound money critics. For decades, and so what is the right way? He said that, there's a number of principles. One is never trust government with a money monopoly. It just has to be gotten rid of. Yes, it's existed for 6,000 years, but it's a bad idea, and it's got to go. Let's get rid of the government money monopoly. That was his first principle. The second one was outrageous. What he said was, look, there's no reason why government has to be the creator of currency. The private sector can create its own currency. And he was speaking about technology at the time. I mean, even, we're talking about the very early stages of kind of computers, and, the digital revolution, at least modernization, was on the horizon. Hayek saw the possibility that, especially with the elimination of the gold standard completely, their money would be ruined all over the world, and there would be some clamoring need for something new, a currency that actually worked, that was global and not national, that was stable, that maybe would increase rather than constantly decrease in value. Interesting prospect. And functioned better as a unit of count, a means of calculation, that would be, digital-ish in a way, that would be modern, and use all modern financial tools to obtain and retain its value. And he speculated about this. What he was talking about was really a kind of a monetary secessionism. We're never going to get control of this, of government's monetary policy. The reason government monopolizes money is for a reason, and it's not to keep money sound and working as it should. The purpose of government monetary policy is actually to ruin the currency on behalf of the elites. So let's forget it and move on. What he argued for was a complete separation between money and the state, but he said in the absence of that, maybe the private sector should just get involved, should just take on the task itself of making money. Let's just recreate it, reinvent it. Now, why wouldn't Gresham's law kick in? Why would anybody want to use a new money that was less inflationary than government money? I mean, wouldn't network effects cause everybody to adhere to the prevailing currency? Wouldn't people just hoard the new, better money, maybe, and continue to use the existing bad money because it worked? Well, Hayek thought that wasn't true. He thought that you could actually break the network effects of the national currency, provided this new currency that he was proposing, that somebody create, was that much better. And what would make it that much better? Well, if it were a global currency, you'd eliminate the transactions costs associated with constantly moving between currencies that were constantly shifting. It's impossible to do business calculations of multinational corporations with constantly changing currency valuations. And we think of the way it used to be in the old Europe before the euro came along. You know, it's very cumbersome for business. So that would be a marketing advantage of a new currency. What else? Retention of its value. You know, it wouldn't be inflated away. I mean, if you had been around in 1979, you would have liked to have had a private alternative to the dollar, because the dollar was losing 13, 14, 15% per year. Exchange controls. You know, if you got all your wealth in dollars, you can't get them out of the country. You know, the exchange controls are ubiquitous these days. So a new private currency might be able to avoid those things. So it'd just be a more functional unit, not just to hold, but to actually use. So he thought that a new private currency was capable of breaking the national monopoly. That's important, because if that were true, then we wouldn't have to use all these political capital and get a national movement to reform the money, which is a hopeless undertaking, he considered. We'd see the monetary reform take place by market means. So the market would choose the new currency just because it's a better currency, and gradually abandon the national currency, or at least leave it on the shelf or use it for a particular purpose, like paying taxes or official business, that sort of thing. But otherwise, might rally around this new currency. Now, this is in 1974. Remarkable, right? So 30 years had to go by. Am I right about it? No, 40 years had to go by before we saw anything remotely resembling an attempt to implement his program. So there were some attempts, though, I must say. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, there were attempts to create private currencies. I mean, one of the more notorious ones was the attempt by Bernard von Nothaus to create a what he called the Liberty Dollar. So he created a new silver a coin as a company, tried to get it monetized. He had a limited amount of success, actually. It wasn't entirely unsuccessful. There was a lot of silver trading going on. They provided storage services in exchange for paper notes, which is a red flag in this world, but there's no reason to think that Bernard von Nothaus was doing anything fishy. He was kind of a pioneer. I mean, it's sort of a rather amazing thing. And there were a number of alternative currencies that popped up really in the 1980s, the 1990s, and the 2000s. They were trying to compete with the dollar. Some of them crazy, some of them scammy, some of them cranky, some of them legitimate. But, they all faltered for one or another reason. One was government would crack down on them, right? Bernard von Nothaus was cracked down on for, I think, under a counterfeiting law or something like that. He never went to prison, by the way. He was convicted and never sentenced, which is funny. He's a really nice guy, by the way. Brilliant man, actually. But the feds came down on him because he created a dollar and thought he was trying to fob it off as the U.S. dollar, which is funny because his whole marketing was not that this is the dollar. It was an alternative to the dollar. Also, what's with the U.S. government? I mean, there are dollars all over the world. There's an Australian dollar, New Zealand dollar, Canadian dollars everywhere. It's not the U.S. dollar is not the only dollar. So, to have a Liberty dollar was not directly competing with, it was not pretending to be a U.S. dollar. The many dollars. I mean, the dollar itself, derives from the Spanish word thaler, which, as a currency dating from the late Middle Ages. So, I mean, it's just so presumptuous and pompous and outrageous that U.S. court slammed him on this basis. I mean, the word dollar, come on, it belongs to everybody. It belongs to the whole world. It belongs to the whole of history. So the word's 500 years old. I mean, it's just utterly crazy that he was slammed for this, especially since he marketed his Liberty dollar as being not the U.S. dollar. So for him to be convicted for pretending this is the U.S. dollar.
Okay, we're going to stop there. Now, no matter where we go with currency, if you're more of a Bitcoin type person or a gold and silver person, don't ever put all your eggs in one basket. Now, when you look at gold and silver right now, what we see is gold and silver is still desirable around the world. In a case where you might need to get across the border, gold and silver might come in handy. If you find yourself already on the other side of the border and you have people that accept Bitcoin, might come in handy if you have a little thumb drive with some Bitcoin on it. So you look at many options, but most people are at home in their local area. So self-reliance and the ability to defend yourself, I think, come into play there. And I don't want to say, we're just going to have this catastrophic breakdown, but the signs are pointing to an authoritarian crackdown. And when you have that, these are the things that have led to war in history. We see a progression where they will continue to do the same things, knowing the results, to push a agenda. And will the people of America, will the people of the world fall for it? Will France, Paris fall for it and allow their freedoms to be taken away when it was the lack of freedoms that allowed for so much death? People mock Donald Trump, but that was one thing he said that was correct. If you had an armed citizenry, basically, in Paris, so much death would have happened. People would have gotten away. But what, taking guns away from people that do the right things, that obey laws, did that make them safer? Did that stop criminal elements? No. It's your freedom. It's your life. Stay free. Stay tuned here on UCY.tv.